All right, in this video, I'm going to talk about camera settings. All right. So for you smartphone people, the advantage of shooting with a smartphone is you never had to learn how these things work, and I do value that I came up, the old school way, and I truly had to learn how to work these things. And it definitely, I value that. But so I thought I'm going to take a step backwards in this video and kind of explain to you, how a camera works. So traditionally, since the beginning of time, cameras have had three settings. Okay, there's aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Okay, and all three of these individually would, if you changed one of these, it would make the image brighter or darker. But basically it would let more light in or let less light in. That's how you change brightness in a photograph. You modify one of the settings so the camera will either let more light in, so the photo will be more bright, or it'll let less light in and it'll be darker. Okay, and each one of these settings can change, but each one of them is different because when you alter it, it will do something different. Okay, aperture and shutter speed are kind of similar, and ISO is a little different. So I'm going to start with aperture. Aperture is just a fancy name for a hole. Okay, it's literally the hole in a lens. Like if you ever see like the FireVibe logo has a aperture ring, the iris in a camera. That's the aperture. And how big or small that iris is depends on how much light comes in. So if you want to let more light in by changing the aperture, you would speed it up, as it's said, which is to make the hole bigger. Now the irony of it is, by making the hole bigger, the number is going to go lower. So it's kind of backwards. So a lower aperture or faster, like 1.8 or 2.0, that's going to let in more light. Okay, but the only difference is the tighter you go, or the bigger you make it, or the bigger you make the aperture, the shallower the depth of field is going to be. Meaning, if you do a really fast aperture like 2.0, it's going to let in a lot of light, but if you were shooting on me, like my face would be in focus, but everything else would be out of focus. Whereas if you went down to like f8 or f16, like everything would be in focus, but it's going to let in less light. Okay, so if you're going to brighten something based on making the aperture faster, you got to be prepared to sacrifice depth of field. All right, so then there's shutter speed. Shutter speed is a unit of time. So you got the aperture, and then there's like a shutter that chops to like let the light in. Okay, it's kind of like a curtain. It's exactly what it is. It is a curtain. So shutter speed is a unit of time, like how long it stays open. Like if you did a 1 second shutter, it would go, so it's pulling in more light. Or a really fast shutter, like 1/100th of a second. So the slower that shutter speed is, the more light it's going to pull in. All right, so if you want more light, you slow it down. Now the problem is, once you get to like 1/30th or 1/15th and below, if you don't have the camera on a tripod, you're going to get motion blur. Okay, so that's why if you're ever outside at night, if you're going to do night photography, you got to do slow shutter speeds. And you need to be on a tripod because it can as long as that camera sits still, you can let that shutter open as long as you want. I mean, you can do 1 second, 5 seconds, 30 seconds, minute, an hour. I mean, literally, like for astrophotography, if you ever see photos of like the stars and stuff, you know, literally it's just a really long shutter. The camera is sitting on a tripod and it's just pulling in all that light. All right, and so the final thing is ISO, which is this random I've never had an easy way to describe ISO. ISO, I guess, just cuts out the middleman with aperture and shutter speed, and it's the sensitivity of the sensor. And you could literally leave if you wanted it to be brighter, you could leave your aperture and your shutter speed the same and just up your ISO, and it will be brighter. Okay, there's one problem though, is the higher the ISO is, the more noise, the more grain will be in the photo. So, you know, especially if you pull the ISO, like, you know, ISO at like 100 is like the low, you're not gonna have any noise. Okay, but if it's too dark and you can't slow down your shutter speed or open up your aperture, you can up the ISO, and that'll allow you to, you know, get brighter images. But especially if you're doing like night photography or something, if you have to get to a high ISO like 2,000, 3,000, you have a photo, but there will be grain and noise in the photo, you know. So that's just how a camera works. It's just those three settings, and you know, it's fortunately, you know, with using a smartphone now, like they've made these things so smart, you really don't have to know what those mean. But sometimes, you know, it's better. Sometimes the problem with smartphones is sometimes you're trying to get a specific thing, like you're doing night photography, or, you know, you want a blurred out background or something like that, or you don't want any noise in it, and sometimes the smartphone doesn't. It's too smart for its own good. It doesn't give you that control. So that is why I do value, you know, that I learned it all the old-fashioned way. But anyways, that's my best attempt to explain the camera settings, because it is complicated. You know, it took me a couple years to really, truly, I mean, I would say years. And I was already shooting professionally, like, before I really figured that stuff out. It's kind of funny. Anyways, all right, that's camera settings.